Now, Africa's richest man, Aliko Dangote, recently stirred up the hornet's nest when he called for a reversal of the privatization process in the power sector. He says it was wrongly done and a reversal was in the nation's interest. To discuss the challenges in Nigeria's power sector, my guests are Tunde Gbajumo, power sector expert. I have Winston Osuchukwu, Managing Director, First Ally Asset Management, and Bimbola Banjo, Power and Utilities Director at Pricewaterhouse Coopers Nigeria. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Interesting to start off with Aliko Dangote's statement there. But I'm going to be starting off with you, Tunde. What do you make of this?
Well, it's quite interesting that he makes that comment. But if you look through what he actually meant, he was saying that some of the assets have been transferred to companies that are probably undercapitalized and some of the owners just don't have the capacity to run them. I would say it's correct. Most of the assets are in competent hands. We should not belittle the macroeconomic environment that we're all in today. The tariff, MITO, is still based on 160 naira to the dollar. We know that the dollar is not 160 naira. It's a lot more than that. And the tariff has not been adjusted to reflect that in its entirety. And they're also working around a very difficult environment with respect to gas vandalization. The transmission network is still quite limited. There's still high distribution losses. There's still significant theft even at the distribution level. And we also know that metering has not achieved the levels that it needs to. So we shouldn't belittle the macroeconomic environment that the operators are now having to deal with. But having said that, some of these assets do have really serious problems and need to be addressed, and the performance agreements that were signed with BP need to be enforced to address those problems.
Interesting. Now, what do you think, Bimbola?
Well, I think the privatization was a necessary step the Nigerian power sector had to take. I think there's no doubt about it. There are issues in the industry. The traction we were hoping that we would have gotten to by this point in time, we haven't gotten. But a whole reversal of the process, I think it's a bit far-fetched. I think one of the things that should be looked at again is the performance agreements. The performance agreements signed by the participants in the sector actually lays out the conditions in which you can actually reverse or call back the assets from the parties who purchased the assets in the first place. But that goes without saying that a lot of work still needs to go into the sector. A lot of work still needs to go into ensuring that these assets deliver what they're supposed to.
Winston, what do you make of this? There are those who say, the businessmen and investors have a very clear understanding of the sector. They say the power sector is up against peculiarities of Nigeria's business environment. That's the argument. What's yours?
Well, I will give them a little bit of that, but it comes back to the same thing. The Nigerian government, in everything it does, needs to be predictable and honest. We privatized this system. We gave them the multi-year tariff agreement, and those tariff agreements were based on very simple and easy to understand rules and regulations, which they have consistently flouted. And when you continue to do that, you make it very difficult for those that are in the business and now need to go and raise capital, to go out there and find capital. Because you're talking to a foreign investor who's looking at you saying, hey, this guy, like he just mentioned, this tariff is based on 165. Your exchange rate has clearly doubled, has depreciated by 50% there, and your tariffs have not moved. It's very difficult to get somebody else to bring in capital to do this, whether the person is a financial or a technical investor. The number one thing that the government needs to take ownership of is to do that. After they do that and they clean up their house and make sure that they're doing their end, then they have the moral high ground to go after those people that own the assets to make sure that they're meeting their own performance. The performance agreements that they have in place for those assets.
Well, so let's assume, these investors are 100% aware of what, they were getting into, or even 100% aware of what's happening at the moment. How much do you think they have achieved over time, after the whole privatization process?
Well, this is one of those really tough things to look at. In general, from just a strict consumer point of view, has power improved? Yeah, it's improved a little bit. but it's not been any quantum leap or significant jump. So there are still questions there. There are some people who said this should have been done in a phased process, which I think might have made some sense. But the one thing that I think was not as aggressively pushed as the unbundling of the system and selling the generation and the distribution was moving the supply chain to move the fuel around. That didn't seem to be as critical a point, and that should have been something that I felt should have been right there at the front of it, because at that point you need to get the gas or whatever fuel we're going to use to the areas where you can generate this power and move on, because if not, the distributor only gets paid if he has power to distribute. And the generator can only generate X amount, and there's a certain point where that capacity runs out. So bridging those two gaps is something that I think wasn't all the way thought through, and going back and having a rethink to bring those three things together and line them up so they start to get there at about the same time, I think that's necessary to make it clear for investors to come back in.
Now, so what do you think of the performance so far? Do you think much has really been achieved?
Well, I had the privilege to participate with Ogeli. I alternated on the board of Ogeli for a few years, and it's a significant improvement. When we took over the asset in November 2013, it was doing 160 megawatts. When I stopped getting involved in Ogeli, it was doing 650 in March 2015, which was less than 2 years. And Ogeli is on the path to get to 800 megawatts early next year. And so if you think about, moving from 160, in the first 6 months it got to 350. That's the power of privatization. That's the power of capacity and management. I always tell the story of the success of Ogeli. Ogeli succeeded for 3 reasons. One was, actually it was a good asset. It was sitting on gas. So it was a good decision by the owners to go after that asset. The second thing was that you had Transcorp, which is a formidable group, people that understood how to raise capital, to inject working capital, to repair the assets. And so that was the second thing. And then the most important part of it, in my view, was the management. So the management was led by someone who had worked on that asset 15 years before on behalf of General Electric. And so he knew exactly what to do, and his team, and they ramped it up very quickly. Sarah has done a similar thing with Egbe Power Station. Egbe Power Station was hovering around 300 megawatts when they took over. And it got to a point where it has capacity to fire all 1,200 megawatts that is available. That's extraordinary. It's never happened in Nigeria. Egbe Power Station has never hit that capacity. So that is the success of privatization. I think for anyone to think that we should reverse that, that person is definitely not an expert in the sector.
Now, Bimbo, going by what he's just said, I mean, of course, there have been some level of improvement. But I'm going to ask, what do you think remains a major challenge hindering, the other ones?
I think one of the major challenges in the sector today is the efficiency of the distribution companies. I think there are a lot of things that will drive profitable growth in the sector. The distribution side of the business is one of the most complex areas to manage. I think the investors in the distribution underestimated what they were getting into. If you look at our installed or available capacity today, we have about 7,500 megawatts of available capacity. But what you actually have is a scenario where only about 50% of that actually gets pushed to the grid. So pretty much we have a 50% efficiency, which is not very good. And it's for different reasons. It's because there's no gas in some instances. It's because the transmission infrastructure can't take it. And in many cases, the distribution companies just don't have where to push this power to. The truth is, the commercial losses that the distribution companies currently have are too high. A lot of work has to go into identifying customers, appropriate metering, converting a lot of consumers to actual customers, and collecting.
What is happening with the transmission space? What's this argument about the fact that our grid cannot handle over 5,000? Talking to the MD of EGMI sometime last year, he did say that at 4,000, they're sometimes asked to shut down for the other, for the other power stations to push up. And I'm asking myself, what are we talking about then?
Well, yes, we have our transmission network possibly can do about 6,000 megawatts or just slightly more than that. And we did get to 5,000 megawatts earlier this year. It means that it can be done. So Yes, you are correct. There's a constraint. That network needs to be upgraded, it needs to be expanded, it needs repairs, and so on and so forth. But there's a parallel track where it's a concept called embedded generation that's being promoted by the regulator. So basically, you don't go onto that. A generator doesn't have to get onto the transmission network, on the high voltage network. You can generate electricity directly at the distribution level, which is the 33 kV and below network, and that way you are not constrained by these problems that we are talking about. Now, the reason why that is not implementable today, apart from technical constraints, is really the commerciality of it. Because if you build new generation, you are looking at, for instance, buying your equipment at 309 naira on the dollar. So you are a lot more expensive than the guy who has his installed capacity based on 160 naira on the dollar. So your new generation gets to the grid, it then becomes too expensive for the distribution company to buy. So what you need is a different arrangement for embedded generation. You need different commercial arrangements, different technical arrangements, and the regulator really needs to promote it. Why is that not happening today? Well, one answer is you haven't had an effective regulator in place for 12 months. So there's so many things that need to be worked upon. I would say, going back to the point that Banjo was making about the problems in the sector, I would say the biggest problem we have today is the lack of coordination between policy on the government side and regulation by the regulator. It's a bit like Central Bank of Nigeria, where our monetary policy is controlled by Central Bank, and then you have fiscal policy with Ministry of Finance. For us to succeed as a country, the monetary and fiscal policies need to come together. But they're independent. The governor of Central Bank doesn't report to the Minister of Finance, and they work together to make the economy grow. Now, with our sector, you have a regulator who's not in place. It's a bit like saying you have an acting governor of Central Bank and you have acting deputy governors. What will be happening to your monetary policy? It will be in a flux. And that's where we are. And then you then have the Minister of Finance summoning bank MDs to a meeting to discuss monetary policy. You can see the confluence of, and that's a bit of what is happening in our sector today. That's the reason why the greatest problem, in my view, is to bring the policy back together. We had a roadmap. That roadmap is now become somewhat outdated. It needs to be updated, and then it needs to go into a plan for the government. It needs to go into the budget. It needs to go into the medium-term expenditure framework. And that's, I think, the biggest problem we have today.
We're going to be touching more of that when we come back. After the break, I've been speaking to Tunde Gbajumo, power sector expert, and Winston Osuchukwu, managing director, First Ally Asset Management, and of course, Bimbola Banjo, power and utilities director at Pricewaterhouse Coopers Nigeria. As we continue our discussion on the challenges in Nigeria's power sector, my guests are Tunde Gbajumo, a power sector expert. I also have Winston Osuchukwu, managing director, First Ally Asset Management, and Bimbola Banjo, power and utilities director at Pricewaterhouse Coopers Nigeria. Thank you so much for staying with us, gentlemen. Well, Winston, just before the break, we're talking about Nigeria's transmission space. To begin with, those who argue it is one of the biggest challenges. Why generate so much when you can't even transmit what you have? But listening to Tunde, of course, he says it's an issue of regulation, a lack of coordination. What's your take?
Well, I actually agree with him totally. It's at the end of the day, if you're creating a plan and you have a limiting factor like our grid, and whatever the number is, 5,000, 6,000 megawatts. This is a country that would easily, if we look at what South Africa does and what we do, could probably be doing, we should be consuming 110,000 megawatts. So we can't have that limiting factor. So what's the next step? If a power plant is generating 5,000 and they can sell it to one area, leave them alone to sell it. I honestly think at the end of the day, you've created a MITO system. It's a nice, I like the way the calculation is. It is something that should be reviewable on a set basis based on set parameters which they've already put in place. Let that happen. Let people start to make investment where investments work. And let's take care of each problem on it at its own speed. Generation, the transmission is an issue. It'll be good for us to get the power across the country, but the design, if time I've spent with a lot of people in engineering, the design of our grid is also a problem because we have all the generation on one side, and by the time you push all that up, we get a lot of losses along the way. So there's a lot that needs to be done around there. So my thought process and thought process of a lot of investors who want to get into the power sector is this: Let us have a willing buyer, willing seller arrangement, whereby we can invest money in generation and give it to the people who are willing to pay. Get out of that business. Let us be able to do that. What that happens is the marginal cost of each additional kilowatt of power that is not used in that area is put on the grid, and that you can send out so that 5,000 or whatever limiting factor becomes less of a speed bump on the growth of the sector as a whole.
I'm buying into that. What do you think?
I mean, I have an interesting position on this, and for me, I think that having side or producing power on the side or through an embedded program, it's quite expensive. It comes at a premium, and in times where it's difficult for the average Nigerian to afford the basics, right? If you think about when most of the power plants we have in the country were set up, we're talking about dollar of 150 naira to $1, and we talked about the industry average of about $1 million for 1 million megawatts of power. In Nigeria, it's slightly higher. It's about anywhere between $1.2 million to $1.5 million to set up a power plant. Now, all of these costs usually are passed on to the customer through tariff. Now, we're talking about current Nigeria of about $1 being about 480 naira, and so it means this same cost still has to be passed through to the final consumer. Now, it's bad enough that we already have to bear the exchange losses and the exchange fluctuations, but then again, now adding the incremental cost that comes with off-grid supply, it's an added burden to Nigerians. And then when you look at it from the standpoint that, look, the off-grid solution is not a permanent fix. Yes, because there's a lot of shortage in supply, it meets the basic need of we need power supply. Yes, it does meet that. But in the long run, you discover that you've spent a lot of money and invested a lot of money in the national grid. And so the question is, what now happens to all that investment? You're going to leave all that investment to fewer customers to bear the burden. And so the way the MITO works is, the assumption is pretty much that all of this power that is generated, all of the transmission infrastructure, all of the costs of the distribution network, all comes into the tariff. But by the time you now start to have increments in different places and different pockets, and then you now begin to take a look at the different factors that add to the pricing of power, which includes things like the price of gas, which is dollar is benchmarked to dollar, and you look at things like the price of power itself, the cost of setting up plants, particularly new plants, because the existing plants were set up at the time when dollar was a lot friendlier. And then you look at all of that translates into, you discover that it becomes a very, very huge burden for Nigerians to bear. So from my standpoint, I think in addition to more work that needs to be done by the regulators, the transmission infrastructure that we said needs to be upgraded and uptooled, we also need to look at what the economy is saying. I think that's a really big factor. I think from my standpoint, cost-reflective tariffs isn't just the fact that you've considered all of the costs within the sector in arriving at the numbers, but also the very important fact that, look, what is the client or the counterparty willing to pay? If you have a cost that is reflective and the counterparty cannot pay for that cost, in finance, then your cost pretty much is what the counterparty can pay.
I think I better jump in here. I'm somewhat in between Wilson and Banjo here on this issue. I think that you have to have parallel tracks. Okay. So, and I think that the policies of the previous NEC administration was going down that track, but they never finished it. So you should have your one national grid, your TCN grid, and then you should have smaller power plants, embedded generation plants across the country. Now, going back to Wilson's point, it needs to be willing buyer, willing seller. Today, your MITO doesn't allow you to do that because it puts everybody in one box. But you should have a new track for a willing buyer, willing seller, where the tariff will maybe significantly higher than MITO. But then the buyer is very happy to take it at that price, and the seller is also comfortable with the price. And if you think about the part of industrialization and agriculture and the sort of GDP growth where we're looking for today, we're saying that we want industrialization and we want agri-processing, we want to add value. So there you must allow people to go to greenfield locations, put their power plants there. You have industrial zones, the tariff will be higher than your MITO. It will be higher than the retail tariff. But the industrial consumers there want to be there because it's the alternative they have is to fire diesel. So your gas-fired generation or your solar or whatever it is that you put there will be cheaper for them. And then it will grow the economy and it will grow. And if you think about, if you live abroad or you go abroad, you look at Dubai or the US or whatever, you know, it seems like our growth is concentric. You need to expand and grow out of town and go to the rural areas. And in Nigeria, we're blessed with gas. We even have gas in a place like Lagos. So what you should be doing is creating industrial centers around that resource that you have. And let your willing buyer and willing seller come together. And regulation should not inhibit that sort of growth. I think that's my view. You should have both tracks.
Okay. Now, Winston, taking a look at transmission to begin with, that's one area that hasn't been privatized yet. Do you think really the solution lies in privatizing that, or even just reviewing the general structure in the power sector, really?
No, the transmission business is always a government business. Nobody put money in that. And if you look at it, Australia tried to sell theirs. It was an uproar. Nobody wants to be in that business. That business is a business where you're going to put in there's a lot of capex over a very long period of time. And a lot of investors, well, like they always say, you know, in the long run, we're all dead.
But then how do we move forward? It's been like this for decades.
But that's the key. At the end of the day, there's some things that every once in a while, everybody needs to stop and ask themselves what is best and not what is politically expedient or what have you. Everybody keeps talking about China, 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 China. Okay, let's go and look at what China did. Central planning, central decision making. China did not electrify the entire country. They electrified the most productive parts of the country. And like we were talking earlier off air, my father doesn't need power. My father absolutely does not need power. The man will never sleep in an air-conditioned house. All he wants is the fan on every once in a while, and he needs something to read the newspaper with. That's it. So every kilowatt of power you send there is giving less back to the entire system than every kilowatt of power that you send to a place like Isolo. Go back to the 70s and the 80s when Isolo was the bastion of manufacturing in Nigeria. That place was on 24/7. If you take all the power that you're sending to my village right now and you put it on there, I guarantee you the people that are coming out of that place might be willing to pay just a little bit more, even the individuals, to get that power. So if we honestly want to solve a problem, we have two choices. We can do it as a central process, centrally planned, and take it done. But in that case, all this whole idea of bringing in private investors will take a backseat. Or we can deal with it as a business. Government take the transmission because that is really a security and a national asset. Hold on to that. But let the rest of the business grow. At the end of the day, here is what always happens. It happened with the mobile phones. It happened with everything. Everybody will overbuild by definition. Nobody ever, if I want 10, I won't build 10. If I want 10, I'll build 15, 20. That excess will now get onto that grid, which you can now take your time, over time, and continue to expand. So if you look at a 20-year period, Lagos will be producing 50% more than it needs. Benin, Port Harcourt, all these industrial places will be producing so much more that they need. That will go into the grid, and you will start to get into the rural areas. And anybody that does not believe that, go back. The UK still has a rule that is pushing the telcos in 2016 to extend high-speed internet to the rural areas. Why do they still have that? Because they let people deal with the people that could pay first, and now they're saying, we've let you do it, you've made your money, now take some of those profits and start to extend it.
Bimbo, now let's take a look at this whole billing issue. How do we resolve this issue? Is it a metering problem, or is it the fact that Nigerians still know that they will get away with it? We really haven't seen anyone who's been prosecuted so far for electricity theft, which is going on by the day. We still see funny individuals up that pole trying to make their own kind of connections. What's your take? Okay,
so remember I said earlier that the distribution side of the business in the power sector is the most complex to manage, right? Yes, while metering is a solution and it's important to meter, but it's not a silver bullet. I think that even with the metering program, it has to be well thought out. It has to be properly planned. It has to be strategic, because you can end up metering and then you still come back to the same kind of loss levels. Now, in terms of distribution losses, or losses at the distribution companies, there are a lot of things that need to be done for you to actually talk about profitable growth or adding value to the discourse. Yes, so yes, you had a conversation, and what it was, look, we've metered, we're still having losses. But so the question is, first of all, what is the coverage? The other issue that, or the issue that is very common is where you hear things around whether the tariff itself is cost reflective. And I know there's something, there's a case in court with the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, where they've asked that the tariff not go up. Those are things that pretty much would affect the performance of Disco.
I really would want us to go on with this, but my friend was just telling me my ear, you were done for for the day. It's really been interesting, and I really do hope we can actually get more out of this. I've been talking to Tunde Gbajumo, a power sector expert, Winston Osuchukwu, Managing Director of First Ally Asset Management, and Bimbola Banjo, Power and Utilities Director at Pricewaterhouse Coopers Nigeria.